basically my job is to be kind. That's what I'm going to do. The closing will also be 15 minutes.
I also need a bag. I just pick up a copy.
Just to introduce, there are basically 3 projects here. I'm not going to do the biological introductions that you already have. It's been circulated, so there's no need to introduce the 3 projects. The first 2 presentations are going to be on a newspaper, which is the Start of Mysore, which Ammel and Aishwarya have been working. They will make presentations on it. So this newspaper is mostly, they will be talking around the 70s and the 80s. So this very sort of dynamic editor gave it a new shape. And what does this archive really tell us? It's very important. That's the first one. There are 2 presentations there. Then after that, Nobina is going to talk about her engagement with 2 schools and the school children in the what is known as the Eastern Calcutta wetland, popularly known as the Salt Lakes. She's going to talk about some projects there, which are projects about art and sort of enablement, which is very interesting. We'll talk about that. And then in the last section, which Madhuja is going to be presenting, she is going to talk about how she's followed a less obvious trail through one of Calcutta's iconic landmarks, which is somehow got hidden, which is what is known as the Adigonga or the Tories. And she's going to tell us about that. So, very briefly, I had some very brief sort of interactions with them. I stayed in Delhi, so we went over Zoom. I read some things they had sent to me also. Some of the themes which were discussed in the morning obviously are very much part of these presentations also. What I want to tell you about the start of Mysore, again I'm anticipating this because the nuanced presentations will follow. Even I haven't heard them. What I was very struck about what Ammel and Aishwarya have said about the start, what they were present about the start of Mysore, is that this is a newspaper. It seems to have a kind of reformist agenda, and it's very interesting because there is this editor and obviously people who support him, or readership which supports him. That's very interesting. There are very interesting letters which are written. And there is a kind of move to claim space in the city. And this happens through the discourse of what I could gather of conservation and heritage to some extent. So this is very interesting, and of course I want to maybe in discussion time we can talk about this. There is a very interesting essay which I think lots of us know, written about maybe 7, 8, 10 years ago by Professor Partho. It's called Have Indian Cities Are They Bourgeois at Last, where he makes a similar kind of argument about how civil society, middle classes and the upper middle classes
the class was alas.
As it become alas, yes. Where they lay claim to spaces in the city, very interesting. And how there is a struggle between the more marginalized groups. But they will talk about it in much more detail. About Nobina's talk, I just wanted to tell you a presentation that it's we know there is an environmental discourse on the salt lakes about its sustainability, how important it is to the environment of Kolkata, how important it is to the ecology of the city. But the city seems to have turned its back to it. But what she is really exploring are the people who actually live. So it's more than 1200 acres, there are 32 villages, and there are people with skills there, and she's trying to document through school children, their everyday experiences in life, which includes some skills through art projects. This is very, very interesting, and she will talk about that. In Madhuja's case, I know I'm being a bit of an academic here, but I think what she's trying to explore, this is, again I'm anticipating this, that we look at the city of Calcutta through its what we call rationalized spaces. But there are other ways in which the city also exists, and we need to understand and document that. That's very important. And the way to, it seems that what she has done walks through the documentation and the installation, which is that it's really about a kind of looking at space socially, and also even randomly. And what is interesting is that it seems that when we look at, and now I know there are many people who work on cities in very interesting ways, that because somebody in the last session mentioned temporality, but I think when we explore space, random spaces in the city, we also have to confront or at least engage with spaces where time often stops, and also where you have a moment to pause. I think in the rationalized city that is something that goes completely missing. So I would be very interested in how you actually look at it. Now, very briefly, I'll take 2 more minutes because it's called Rethinking Public Histories. I think we need to look at all this again, all these terms. At least I made me certainly made me think. So instead of saying rethinking, I would like to slightly revise it. Maybe we should call it restating public history. Because all these projects that I heard today morning and now that's going to present, it's really bringing back public histories in ways which we need to do. And here I must mention that just a few days ago, I read a marvelous essay by a historian, some of you may know, by Janaki Nayak in the Hindu, called Imaginary Histories, and where she says, what are we up against? Historians are up against the state, they are up against the party, and they are up against also the community. So, I think public histories is one way in which we need to reclaim that, that's very, very important. That's one thing. The second thing is that when we think about the history, we are talking about narratives, right? I mean, that also was stated in the morning session. And I think one way that became obvious, and because very obvious particularly, and because I know a little more about Nobina's work, that it's going to be about through telling stories, through different kinds of stories. Not only stories, but also activities. I think that is very, very significant. And so stories, activities, and what I think Nobina is suggesting, and she'll talk about it in more detail, that this is actually transformation. So these narratives are really, really going to taking us in a different kind of publishing. I think that's where it becomes very important. Thirdly, the word archive has become so important to us now. We are thinking about archives in different ways. As a historian, when I think of the archive, of course we think of the colonial archive. That is, we love the colonial archive actually. But this is the archive of the survey. I mean, I know this, everybody knows this. This is what he tells us. I have to tell you, I have to say this as a historian, that even this colonial archive can produce real surprises. You may find a lock of hair stuck on the page. You may find a thumbprint. You may find a suicide note. It really completely changes the view on what is being recorded. So there is the colonial archive, of course. But what are all these panelists really saying? I was asking myself, and I think what they say is that this archive has to be participatory. That is a different kind of archive, and I think that's what all of them are really going to do. That is their project. One last small point. Then what is the point I have to begin to ask ourselves, why are we doing all this? And I think it's a really large question. This also was raised in the morning session, which is that it's really in the end about citizenship. Now, how do we belong? And some of this work really focuses on what I would call, they not only bring the local, but they also defamiliarize the sort of the dominant notions of what participate, write their own histories. I think that is so important to this larger project that we think about. So, with those opening remarks, I will now request Ammel.
Thank you. My presentation is divided into 3 parts. First, I speak about how I came to the Star of Mysore archive and why it provides insights that may not be found elsewhere. Second, I speak further about my interest in the everyday history of the University of Mysore and gesture towards certain strands of inquiry which have remained understudied in the field of higher education. And finally, I moved to work with an archival project, the Queer Archive at the National Law School in Bangalore, in the middle of this fellowship, and would like to provide a few preliminary observations about non-state public archives. So the reason I applied for the IFA Star of Mysore Archival Fellowship is because my PhD research is on manuscriptologists who have shaped the Kannada public sphere. Manuscriptology is typically a dry, painstaking affair which will severely affect one's eyesight. And yet these pedantic scholars shaped not only literature but politics. They were institution builders as well, and one was even assassinated on account of it. And so I became interested in various aspects of scholarly cultures within and outside the university, across Bijapur, Harvard and Bristol over the 20th century. And this is why I thought that the Star of Mysore newspaper, established in 1978 and continues to run, would provide an interesting perspective on the University of Mysore in independent India. So I work on D.L. Narasimhachan, and that's some of the collections of literary writers and literary scholars at the University of Mysore. But what perspective can a newspaper bring that cannot be found elsewhere? Historians have sometimes treated newspapers only as sources of factual information. But as the historian Jerry Nilsson points out, our concern need not be with what actually happened in any given time or place, but also with what people thought was happening, as revealed to them through the means of mass communication, which may have conditioned their subsequent actions. This need not be limited to editorials, but the way in which news is presented, and truth or lies, it creates public opinion. And that public opinion is the creation of public opinion is the stuff of history. The historian of Indian newspapers, Robin Jeffrey, begins his study of what he calls newspaper revolution in India by saying, in 1976, if you had divided among India's 755 million people the number of newspapers produced each day, you would have had more than 80 people clustered around each copy. People discovered ways to think about themselves and to participate in politics that would have been unthinkable a generation before. And so this, Aishwarya will speak more about the kind of reformist or activist way in which the Star of Mysore has functioned. This is just one of the things that the Star of Mysore did. In the light of a student suicide, it set up, a helpline was set up at the district police station, and a lot of letters were routed through the Star of Mysore. But historians view the large newspaper business as conservative, and this is something I'd like us to keep in mind, reflecting the views of their business person owners. Jeffrey goes to the extent of saying that secessionist movements have been most common in those regions where local capitalism is least developed, and certainly where successful capitalist newspapers are least developed. But he also points out that in the Indian scenario, it is not economic growth that fueled newspaper circulation, but rise in literacy rates. Now, my interest in the Star of Mysore was because it is a small city newspaper with a sister publication in Kannada. Both these newspapers come up just at the time of this newspaper revolution. And secondly, the Star of Mysore promised to give us a peek into the University of Mysore. So the very first editorial of the newspaper, 1978, said, our investigative reporter will sneak into the municipal council hall, go nosing around the university campus, walk footloose along the police beat, amble into the hospitals, slink under the seat of power to publish in cold print all that you always wanted to know but could not. Now a star is born to fulfill that need. So this is university reporter would go to get news. More importantly, newspaper coverage is often sustained over a period of time on events that might quickly fall out of public memory. Many of these developments are not reflected in annual reports. They may not lead anywhere that is deeply significant. They are part of autobiographies. They make news at a particular time but are off the record everywhere else. In this sense, even when I look for students in the archive, it is not student movements, which have been very ably written about of late. I was looking instead for contours of the everyday. But why the University of Mysore? It was the sixth university set up in British India in 1916 and by a princely state. Manu Bhagwan has a great book comparing the establishment of Mysore University and Baroda University as hidden scripts of resistance, he says. And one may also read Janki Nair's fantastic probing of the contributions of regional modernity in her book Mysore Model. Yet, what is generally missing are links between histories of higher education in the early 20th century and post-independent higher education. The start of Mysore was to help me flesh out this scenario, but on the one hand, private investment in colleges and universities, sort of increases manifold, to the extent that by 2005, we have as many private universities as we do public universities. And secondly, education becomes more accessible to large numbers of students, but also the demographic among faculty members is changing. So where Brahmins were 3% of the population in the 1940s in Mysore state, they occupied over 40% of the university, followed slightly distantly by the Lingayats, who come to be known as a dominant caste, a term coined by a Mysore-born scholar, Ammel. So I'm going to club the coverage that comes up into micro stories, administrative, political, campus life, and off-campus. I would argue that we not tell a comprehensive history of the university, but follow the coverage to develop each of these as independent strands. The point is not to write a biography of the institution, but to see how the Star of Mysore facilitates the creation of public. Through the 80s, it is only a 4-page newspaper, but there is something on education nearly every day in the newspaper, and as you would see, typically on the front page of the newspaper. So the administrative micro story. The tenures of vice-chancellors and the role of the Senate and Academic Council earns the ire of the newspaper. Vice-chancellors and these academic council meetings receive a lot of often polemical coverage. People come to blows. There is a lot of psychophancy around the election of the VC, and from time to time, the Vice-Chancellor of Mysore University is obliged to respond within the letters to the editor section of the Star of Mysore. The administrative side of higher education is almost never reflected in writing on higher education. But I would like to point out that there is a very interesting autobiography by D.C. Partho, who was he was both governor of Punjab, he was also the vice-chancellor of Karnataka University in the 50s and 60s. And it's called Memoirs of an Educational Administrator. And he sort of talks about how he became a VC. So he lands up one day in Harvard, he's called for the election, and he sees that there's a rampant electioneering happening around, with supporters of the VCs all like doing a lot of campaigning. It's a very dramatic and very interesting autobiography. The second is about the financial health of the university, and the 80s are a time when capitation fees are being introduced. There's a lot of outrage around the fees. This was also a time when states were being compelled to invest more in education. And academics are also writing about the same. For instance, D.M. Datta wrote a book on university budgets and expenses. And he became vice-chancellor of both Bangalore University and Karnataka University, Harvard. At the University of Mysore, like on the other side of the spectrum, sociologist C. Parvatama undertook state-funded studies about the prospect of employment for university-educated graduates, which I recommend all of us to read. I mean, those of us who are still students. And now I go on to the political sort of micro-story. Another often elided account of education is the transition from secondary education, what is called pre-university college in Karnataka, to university education. And between the 80s and early 2000s, one finds innumerable strikes by teachers over pay scales, assault, evaluation duties, etc. And teachers disrupting education is fairly common. And these strikes across humanities, engineering, medicine often last weeks, sometimes months. And so in one instance, which went on for over a month, when pre-university college teachers were on strike, university teachers were roped in to evaluate examination fees. Another fairly interesting aspect of politics is the graduates' constituency in the Legislative Assembly, where only graduates were allowed to vote for an assembly seat. The logic, it seemed, was that graduates would make more informed choices. Given the premium placed on education in the newspaper, it does not seem a coincidence that Mysore had a graduates-only political constituency, and I'd be interested to hear if there are other parts in India where such a constituency also existed. The next micro story I talk about is what I call student exchange. There are vibrant student stories that receive coverage in the Star of Mysore, and it's really about students traveling between states and speaking with each other, living together. And what is interesting is that much of this exchange is facilitated in a sustained manner in the 80s by the ABVP, and none of this is political coverage. What would be interesting for researchers is to follow up with these students or with chapters of the ABVP to see what memories of these exchanges were like. The newspaper is also where international students are given some coverage. And I wanted to use this visibility to argue that in the international student figure is a pedagogic provocation for education in India. Typically, Indian institutes treat international students as de facto cultural ambassadors. But we may consider that 1/5 of international students, just under 50,000 students today, that number is set to increase, they come to Karnataka and many come to Mysore. And it was under the sociologist Indira Ramna that an international student center was also built up. The challenge is to follow up on this coverage and interview international students and think about ways in which we might critique the cultural ambassador or the surveilled subject of the police that they usually fall into in terms of representation. And coming from Cool, which is well known for its generation of sports persons, the editor K.B. Ganapati both patronized sport and dedicated entire issues to university sports, a sign of commitment to local news, investment in sports, and also sports for sports' sake. Right? Here too we find considerable exchange between students and traveling. Now the off-campus micro-story, a key institution in Mysore between the 80s and 90s was C.D. Narasimhaiah, professor of English, and the institution he founded called Datta. It came to enjoy both national and international recognition, hosting scholars from across India and abroad, particularly within the Commonwealth. And given his familiarity with Mysore University, CDN as he's affectionately called, also played a role in galvanizing civic activists to save the Mukherjee lake, which is part of the university campus but was neglected by it. And so the newspaper also gives like a lot of coverage to this effort. The second off-campus effort is the role of the philosophy department, which hosts many voices from outside the university. Now, philosophy in the Indian university is a vexed subject. Usually it revolves around Vivekananda. Here too, what comes to be prominent is the role of values in education. The department once hosted the Brahma Kumaris on just this topic. If one were to follow the argument of Sanjay Sheth in his book Subject Lessons on Western Education in Colonial India, we would weigh this question of what is assigned value in the university, the seriousness it deserves. Where earlier much discussion revolved around the unfortunate values of Western education, the anxiety was about the kind of subjects being created through these lessons. Values that the university is seen as imparting today offers us an opportunity to look at university codes of conduct and track both internal and external conversations about values. So, as part of the queer archive for memory, reflection and activism at the NLSIU, I've had the opportunity to think about the role of community archives and amateur archivists in some contrast to professional archives. This is still the Star of Mysore, this is not Kanda, but this is the the reception area, and those are the huge newsreels. I didn't take any pictures of inside the office space because I didn't ask permission. But to think a little bit about the contrast between amateur archives and professional archives, what public archives like community archives do, often without assured funding, is recognize value where professionals don't. It's a rare historian who sets up an archive, though my own archival thinking was probably influenced by my teachers at the CSSC in Kolkata. But we might recognize that amateur, a word that derives from a root that means love, is critical to the survival and expanse of community archives. In this sense, the Star of Mysore, which is more documentation of its work than an archive. For the archivist is missing, and so is their knowledge and labor in envisioning the archive as a site for knowledge production and an imagination for the future. Like the historian, the bound volumes of the Star of Mysore concern the past, often used to reference old articles and moments of nostalgia. But thinking of this repository as an archive, the IFA Star of Mysore collaboration is an opportunity to recast and imbue the collections with a sense of the future.
Hi. So picking up where Ammel left us, while Ammel's focusing on the University of Mysore, I'm looking at how the Star of Mysore has reported on heritage structures across Mysore city. Now, Mysore is a city that refers to itself as a heritage city. When you enter the city, there's a big banner that says "Welcome to the Heritage City." When you Google it, the district administration websites talk about how it's a heritage city. But there has, over the last 3 decades or so, there's been a lot of change and growth that has happened in the city, and I was curious to see how that reflects and how the city continues to think of itself as a heritage city, and the Star of Mysore archive seemed like the perfect place to start. And what is also happening is, because so much of the city is changing, this is also giving me an opportunity to document how these buildings have been reported, how they looked visually since the 80s, 90s, and what has changed a little bit now. This is the opening of the Star of Mysore offices itself at the BD Bhavan. And like Ammel said, the Star of Mysore has been around since 78, and they're actually an English evening newspaper daily in a city like Mysore, which is largely Kannada speaking. So their sister concern, which is the Mysore Mitra, is a morning newspaper. It's a broadsheet. It comes out in mornings along with other newspapers. They cover districts around Mysore city. But the SOM covers Mysore and comes out in the evenings at 5 o'clock in the evenings. And when you talk to people about how they read the Star of Mysore, they say, "Coffee jote Star of Mysore make." So with their coffee, they have to have Star of Mysore. And it's also interesting because the population of Mysore right now is close to around 10 lakh people. But the Star of Mysore has a readership of about 2 lakhs. And they also are online, but there's no paywall at all. So I know the large number of my cousins who live in foreign countries read the Star of Mysore even today, but through the online portal where it's not paywall, so it's easily accessible. And one thing that constantly comes up as well, so in September this year, I had a small session in Mysore in a restored structure, which is actually now a chocolate factory. And a whole bunch of people from the city came to talk about what they think is the heritage of the city. And one thing that constantly comes up is something called Mysore culture. And it keeps coming up again and again while I'm in conversation with various people across the city. And now, apart from thinking about what is Mysore heritage, I'm also thinking about what is Mysore culture and how it ties into all this built heritage that is in and around the city. And a little bit of context about the city itself is one thing that when you're walking around the city and you ask someone, how old is this building? They'll say, Maharaja Kaldar Kattu. It was built at the time of the Maharaja, which is accurate because in 1799, when Srirangapatna falls and Tipu is killed, the British moved to Bangalore and the Warriors moved to Mysore. So all of these buildings that I focus on right now, all of the buildings that come up in the course of this presentation, are built in the 1800s articles and after by the Maharaja of Mysore and various Maharajas and all these demands. So it's true, when everybody does know the history, when they say, it was built at the time of the Maharaja. There are a couple of instances where built heritage comes up in the newspaper. The first is, this is the Lal Mahal Palace, which was built a small little gazette, a snippet of when it was built in the 90s, but is as a guest house. And it continues to be used as a hotel. So here it's featuring on the front page of the newspaper because in 1993, chief ministers are meeting to discuss the water sharing of the Krishna River. So the building is prominent for who's going to be coming there to talk about it. So it features itself on the front page. And in the same gazette, on that side, you see a list of buildings that are being built, have been built in Mysore. And they keep coming up during the course of the presentation. You see the Lansdowne Bazaars, the Chamraja Technical Institute, the KR Hospital, the New Oriental Library, the KR Hospital, which is the biggest hospital in the district. And the reason the KR Hospital comes up in the news is because it's being granted money for restoration. Now this is a very recent article from 2022. Over the 80s and the 90s, what happens is the hospital turns up in the newspaper because they're looking at facilities for beds, they're looking at facilities for toilets, they're looking at how medical facilities in the hospital are functioning. But over the past 3-4 years, the hospital turns up in the newspaper because of how much budget is being allocated for the restoration of the building itself. So there's a change in how the hospital itself being spoken about in the newspaper because the medical facilities have been split. The medical facilities are different, the building itself becomes different because of how old it is and how much it is being conserved. And of course, as we read the article, we realize it's also a lot of MLAs from the city who are saying we need funds to restore. And it's also so third instance is when there's a centenary celebration. Somehow this 100-year mark is like, you cannot get past it. It's a 100-year-old building and there's something to be celebrated. So the Chellavamba Hospital, which is one of the first few maternity hospitals to be set up in the district, celebrates a 100-year anniversary in 1981. So the government is setting up a committee to celebrate the 100-year mark of the The Oriental Research Institute, again, on the front page because it's been there for 100 years. Chowdhury in the city, this doesn't go on the front page, it's not as important, this goes on page 4. The Varsity Evening College, and then every time there is Dasra, that is every year a Dasra procession is held in Mysore city, and every year something or the other gets cleaned or set up because everyone has to prepare for this large event of Dasra, which is also interesting because that is what is considered to be Mysore heritage. It harks back to the Vijayanagara kingdom where they say, these Vadiya kings are continuing that tradition so that Mysore, the procession of the Dasra, the torchlight parade that happens after, is this huge, most important event of the year. And attached to that is the Mysore Palace. So when thinking about Dasra and heritage and Mysore and built heritage, I wonder then if the Abbavilas Palace, which is the main Mysore Palace where the lighting and all that happens and a lot of tourists go there, and the Dasra processions, which are again a large tourist attraction, is there that split between tourism and heritage, and are only tourist things that are tourist attractions given more importance in the city? Of course, questions that I'm still asking because I don't think there's a conclusion to reach here at this point. And this is, of course, the biggest anxiety that everyone in the city has is how do we beautify the city? Or how do we retain the beauty of the city? And there are words like save, protect, that are constantly there in the 80s and the 90s. And of course, of the 2000s, it becomes conserve, restore, value, words that, hashtags that turn up in these articles, in the headlines that are there. And I assume that this this is what they mean when they say they want to beautify Mysore, because this is from the 1890s. So I don't think that's possible. Everywhere around this area now is markets. And one of the things that comes out of the Star of Mysore's archive is the voice of the reader. So when I started looking at the newspaper, I started with this idea that the newspaper somehow might have influenced the way heritage and culture is spoken about in Mysore city. But then as I started going through the archive, I realized it's a very symbiotic relationship that the newspaper shares with the people of the city, because it's a very hyper-local situation that's happening. A, because the city is so tiny, everybody knows everyone else, right? And everybody is, in a way, reading everything that happens in the Star of Mysore. So there is a lot of conversation that happens between the newspaper, the public, as well as sometimes the city corporation, and everyone's responding through the readers' letters to each other sometimes. Which then brings me to the question of, in some way, like, what is the tone that the newspaper takes with regard to built heritage? This is an article from 1982. It's written by the founder editor, Kirit. And I mean, I saw the headline and I was like, okay, this is not something I'm used to reading. These are not headlines that you see in today's newspapers. But he's basically, the Jagannath Palace is a palace that was built by the Mysore Maharaja. It was a temporary home that has now been turned into an art gallery. And in 82, of course, because it's an art gallery, there are constructions for shops happening around the Jagannath Palace. And Kirit does not believe that that is something that should be done. He thinks it's a terrible thing to happen, and he in fact asks their importance, how would you like preserved, protected and developed this important tourist center historical landmark? He's asking it in the second paragraph there. It's a question that he puts out to his readers on the front page of the newspaper. And he doesn't get his way because shops were built, shops are still there. And though the palace has been restored beautifully and the art gallery still continues to function, but this is essentially the tone in which most changes to heritage structures are spoken about in the city, in the newspaper itself. Which then brings us to readers' letters, where this reader is writing in 1984, 2 years after that article, saying there are constructions happening outside the law court, and I'm writing to you because I know that this newspaper cares about these structures. So maybe the way that you report about these things will change the way that this construction is happening. And of course there are readers who write in saying, I don't want my tax money to be used for shops. So it's okay if you demolish the Lansdowne building, which is a bazaar again that's built here. And currently it's collapsed. Part of the Lansdowne building is collapsed. And all of the traders who were in the building have been moved to the opposite side of the road in like makeshift shops. So they're all still functioning from the same area, but the building itself is being restored. And the Devraja market, which is what started me off on this entire journey of trying to understand how heritage and built heritage is looked at in a city that likes to, so when I talk to anybody about the Devraja market, they say this is living heritage. Jeevantwa market, it's something that's alive. And when I spoke to, okay, let me get to that point. But this is the Devraja market, which is next to the Lansdowne building, and it's at the center of a large controversy at this point because the corporation wants to break it down and rebuild it. The traders who work at the Devraja market, who have shops there, do not want to move out. They do not want it to be broken down. They are pushing for it to be restored. So there's a tussle between the corporation, the people whose livelihood comes from the Devraja market, between whether it is the conservators and the historians in the city who are wondering whether the building is safe enough. There's a heritage committee which is made up of people from the corporation and two conservators, so there's like a lot of controversy happening there. And then there's also the question of rent, which keeps coming up when they're talking about leave the building and go. And the Devraja market, this is another interesting thing that happens is that in the 90s, this is the clock tower opposite the market, and a citizen clock towers. Because how can you have a clock tower in the middle of the city? That's not working. So he leads a protest. Over 100 people joined him, as you can see, in this, and it works. The clock towers are working now. So Mr. Chandrasekhar was very successful in getting the corporation to do its job. The Devraja market features in the newspaper when there's a disaster. That's like the one instance where a inherited structure is definitely bound to make it to the newspaper when something bad happens. A fire, parts of the arch collapsing, and again another fire in the 1990s. And what happens after this 1990 fire is that the tenants vacate part of the market for the corporation to restructure, rebuild that part of the market that's burned down, on the assurance that they will be giving those shops back. But once those shops were remade, the corporation says, no, we're not going to give it back to you, we're going to put it up for auction, so you can win it again in auction if you want. And that's when this sort of distrust between the traders in the market and the city corporation begins. But of course, the traders are smart, and they overnight they open the shops, they set up their wares, and there's no way that they're pushed out of the shops again. And news cycles are unforgiving, so eventually all of these go out of the newspaper. You don't, after a day or two, you don't find them again, until a reader again writes in asking what has happened to the people of the Devraja market. And it comes up again and again. This is another market very recently that collapsed. And every time there is talk of vacating the building, the Devraja Market Association goes on a hunt. And in 1981, when the market burned down, money was given by 4 prominent citizens / businessmen in the city to help rebuild it. Now, really, it always surprises me that these people get a full front page splash of how much they contributed to the money that they spent in, and every time the association goes on a hunt, it's a small thing that appears elsewhere. So another thing to be really curious about is what kind of space the newspaper is giving to build heritage to the city. Of course, INTAC itself is expressing concerns over the use of buildings and whether they'll be maintained properly. They are. This building is perfectly safe right now. And again, I'll end with this slide because it's a reader, a very disgruntled reader who's questioning various things, but I like the headline. It says, what heritage, what is the Mysore heritage that you're preserving? Because when I speak to Madhuja, who is the union leader of the Traders Association in the Devraja market, I asked him why should this market be preserved? And it's really curious. He says, apart from the living heritage thing, he says, don't you have old parents at home? Would you kill them off just because they're old? It's a bit shocking to hear that, but that's essentially how they're thinking of these structures, because these are people who work there. So be it the Devraja market, be it the Kirit hospital, be it the Kava, which is the institute, the art institute, which is attached to a library, be it the Chelmaba hospital, almost all of these places, because they're built in the 1800s with a specific purpose in mind, they're still used for those purposes. So they're part of the daily lives of people. So it is not surprising, I guess, that they think of these spaces as a living being, as an identity itself. So that still brings me to the question of what is Mysore culture then? Because when we speak to architects, when we speak to civil engineers, when we speak to people who live in heritage houses, they say we're losing Mysore culture. But that culture is entirely different. The way that culture of Mysore is viewed is entirely separate from the way that you say, is this not a living, breathing market for you to consider saving it? So there are these two different strands of ideas running in the city in itself, and how various people in the city think of conservation and restoration and how, in the case of Sharon Mysore, over the years has been reporting over it. And I just end here talking about what is it then, what is the heritage that Mysore wants to preserve, and what is the culture that they want to preserve. Hello everyone. Thank you, Partho, for giving that introduction. First of all, I would say that the work we do is in these Kolkata wetlands, and I'm not sure that many of you all have come to Kolkata, and because we're talking about heritage, what comes to my mind is how many people have recommended you to go to these Kolkata wetlands, because the moment you talk about heritage, Kolkata will talk about Maidan, they will talk about Victoria Memorial, but we hardly, this whole name about these Kolkata wetlands never occurs on space. So this project which we're doing is done by a collective which is known as Disciplining Collective, and I have a whole team over here. So I'll just first introduce them. There's Shaptoshi, there's Majulika and Heidi. I think you can just raise your hands. And there are many more who work together, and we work with the children in East Kolkata wetlands. So the idea is to really look into archives or look into how we work within the community to see what is existing and what is important, and also to address the challenges. So it's not just the assets but also the challenges, and how that could be addressed in ways that the children they're empowered in the process. So as Partho was saying, that this is not just archiving but also seeing that how this archive could help others in a transformative way. And our project was titled as Jolla Bhumi's Korpokotha, and that itself tells you it's about the stories of wetlands, which we found were very important. And as I say, that none of people within Kolkata, although there are hardly a pocket full of people who know about the wetlands, who know about the stories of wetlands. And that is why this whole idea about working around this was important for all of us as a collective. And why is, what is the kind of archive are we creating? The archive is different in the sense that we are not looking at the archive which has to be recorded and kept somewhere, but it is a living archive which exists in that social spatial reality within the surroundings that this community exists. In actually 2021, we wrote this article where I and Shaptoshi were trying to idea that what should be our notion of looking into archives. Should archives be static spaces? Should museums be spaces that we just collect objects? And that is why in the morning I was talking to Keshav about the tribal museum and how things within these communities could be recorded. Do we really need to take them out from those spaces and represent them in other surroundings, or they can live where they are, and how important that archive then becomes, so that space could be thought about. So that's one notion I think we would like to bring among all that we would like to state through this presentation. So what is East Kolkata wetlands? Just to give an overview, it's 12,500 hectares, as you read, of wetlands which exist just beside Kolkata. So now where we are, which is the Kolkata Center of Creativity, and if you go on the top of the terrace and you look that side, you'll see a lot of water bodies, and the wetland actually starts from there. And it's surprising that a few years ago, like 4 years ago, we did an exhibition and we got pictures which we shot from the top here, which had so many water bodies, and now when we look, it's filled with construction. So as in each and every day, a particular wetland is being encroached, and it is it's dynamically changing the whole livelihood, the whole practice of the wetlands, and the city doesn't realize that how dependent it is to this wetland. Kolkata shares a symbiotic relationship with these wetlands, and it is not just a water body, but the whole ecosystem that exists within, and the whole sustenance of the city
Kolkata is because of these Kolkata wetlands, because Kolkata doesn't have a waste management system. It is one of the largest sewage-fed wetlands in the world, and people in Kolkata are not aware of a treasure trove like this in their own backyards. And that's alarming in itself, and that is why the whole idea is why are we not recognizing it? What is the reason? What is the power gain behind it? What is keeping us away from really recognizing a space like this, a unique ecosystem, or which is also upheld by the practices of the community. Now looking to Kolkata and looking to the East Kolkata wetlands, you can see how large the amount is. And when we really talk to people showing this presentation, you can actually not have an idea what East Kolkata wetlands is. I would urge the people who are in Kolkata to visit the wetlands sometimes. We also have started a small eco-trail with the community children. So please, you can connect to us and go for the trail. Because once you see the wetlands, when you experience the life and the culture that they have there, the practices, the everyday practices that are there, you really realize that it's so unique, it's so different, and it's not just very far from it, something just behind the space you are existing. And this is the threefold function that it does, we have to just put it into a very short format. One is food production. Kolkata, we know, we get a lot of fresh fishes early in the morning which arrive. So a lot of the fishes come from these wetlands. But how do they arrive here? The fishermen get into the fish ponds at 3 o'clock in the morning. And that is why the fishes actually land up to our markets early morning, and they're all alive, and we're so happy about having them in our houses and in our dishes. The other most important thing is the wastewater. Every day when we flush our toilets, we really don't realize where does the wastewater go. So this is a very, invisible thing that we really, we've been asking the same question to everyone, and no one has the answer because no one has really thought about this. The whole city is engineered in a way, there's a lot of wastewater canals flowing through. And the moment you look at these wastewater canals, people would always think them as waste. Oh, open drains. Hey, you want to put it that will be always the notion. There are lots of mosquitoes. And that is why what is happening is people are throwing waste into these wastewater canals. But these wastewater canals are the main arteries. They are the veins of the city that keeps you alive, because Kolkata doesn't have a waste management system and it won't be able to afford one. That's very true. So, and plus we have an organic system which is so unique. The whole wastewater is treated organically through sunlight and through a symbiotic relation between algae and bacteria. And we also get fish and vegetables produced out of it. So it's an ideal example of circular economy. It's an ideal example of sustainable living. But we are ignoring it. We are looking into it in a very different perspective. The third thing is the ecological balance. Kolkata is still living, it is under pollution alarm, but then still it is existing because of this whole ecosystem that we have. When we have Ayla and Yash, we wonder that, thank God it didn't hit us. But the moment this wetland is gone, it's we don't know where Kolkata will be. So either it will be drowning in its own waste, or it will be flooded with water, or we will really have to think, I don't know what alternative we will have to think about. So with this whole background in mind, the whole thing is, how do we approach this place? The idea is to develop a collaborative process with the children of East Kolkata wetlands. So there are two schools that we work with, and these children, with them we've been working around how art practice could be, play the role of a catalyst. How could catalyze change within this environment, not just to make them look into their own realities, but also to be able to find their own voices within these communities. So the whole project has been very interdisciplinary, and the main idea was it is important to look into it as a holistic one whole and not segregate it. You cannot segregate one thing from the other. Their everyday life is as important as their the practices that they have, or their cultures, or their traditions that they follow, or the kind of recipes that they make. So everything is as important, and these are the other projects that has been running around it. So I will not dwell into the details of other projects which we've been doing. And because it's an interdisciplinary project, of course, our team is also very interdisciplinary, and everyone comes within the collective with their own skills in mind. Trying to ideate how everyone's skill can be, like, we could work together to come up with alternatives which could address these critical situations that I was talking about earlier. The other thing was amplifying community voices. The moment we started working in these wetlands and we asked these children, like, what does your father do? They would shy away saying that, oh, my father is a waste picker, a fisherman, or a mother is a waste picker, or, to just feel that, I belong to a community like this would make them feel somewhere low and deprived. So the whole idea was, how do we really make them feel, make them understand that where do they stand, how important they are for the city, what is the activity that their father or mother dwells in every day, and how does it really affect the life of thousands in the city. So this whole story, for them to also understand and for us to also take beyond, is what was very important for us while I'm telling the stories. And then we applied for of course, the Padi and IFA grant. And the whole idea was, through a very organic process, how do we really come up with a way that they really are confident enough to tell their stories, to be able to speak up about these ground realities, to be able to think that the knowledge that they hold is actually knowledge. It's worthwhile. It's not something that is written in textbook, which is important, which we at times think that that's the only knowledge that exists. But there's a lot of knowledge on ground. There's a lot of intangible knowledge. And how does that intangible knowledge really is valued? And for this project, we called them as Jalabhumi. And we focused on these following three trajectories. Of course, storytelling was the main thing that we were doing. But through the storytelling, there were other aspects also that we were trying to look into. Like the stories would be bringing in all these little nuances that exist in their families, in their surroundings, in their environment, and how do we see a future from there. So while starting with this work, we were really wondering that from where do we start? How do we really start the process of recording stories or making them understand that we have to really tell them that anything and everything you can work a story around. So you have to just start look into your house, look into your surroundings, write down, Interestingly, we come to that point, we started our project during COVID. So that was another added challenge to it. But the whole idea was how do they record these stories, how do they find these stories, and how do they tell them to others? And what does this, the whole process of storytelling does to them? So to just find out, start the process of finding stories, the whole idea was we would go to these the wetlands we were visiting, even during COVID, whenever it was possible, we have visited the communities and the villages, and we would travel around, and everything they would see, either some of them have smartphones, so they would do photo documentation, and they would send us, we made a WhatsApp group, they would send it on that. Or sometimes they would just sketch and draw, and because many of them, they do not have an exposure towards art and any kind of drawing, but then they have an inherent skill and inherent talent. So the idea was how all those talents could be pooled together to really investigate into this. And then also finding the stories. The stories sometimes you have to really go in, and we would tell them dig deeper, ask your grandparents, ask your neighbors, ask your friends, what would be, or if you find something, what more you can add in. So when we were doing this storytelling section, it would be, we will be doing, if it's an online session, it would be maybe late at night, and then the children would say, ma'am, aaj ke hame ek pakhita dekhi thi. And they will be so excited to share that. So this whole joy of the process of finding a story, telling a story, and being able to share it and value it was very interesting. The other thing, sorry, I missed a slide. The other thing that we were trying to do is, through this whole process, how does it help them to build their capacity? Because as I was saying, that some of them were really good in sketching, so we were seeing how they could do sketches and drawings and bring up some of them have made beautiful, comic strips out of it, writing stories and documenting them. Some of them have written poetry, some of them have done drawings, and even a girl, his name is Rusha, she is such a wonderful photographer that we really feel that someday, if the way she's progressing, she might become one of these talented budding photographers in the future. So this is how like the whole capacity building process really happened, and every little thing that they would be noticing or they would be sharing, we would tell them that how important this was. Like there you see, she's Nobina, and the leaf that she has is known as Bharanda Pata. But interestingly, when you break that leaf, there is a tube that you can actually blow bubbles out of. And it's so magical that you really, and then here you see there are fruits. There are such fruits which have seeds which have love signs on them. Fruits which have small like seeds with Barbies, dolls kind of a thing. So very simple things which they see around them is so interesting and so important. Then someone would really go, that side you see that's a bird watcher society with whom we collaborated, and we took them to the fields for bird watching because you have a lot of migratory birds coming here. And these children would say, oh, I would see this bird every day, but I would have never known about this, because the moment you see a bird from a standing scope and you see how the behavior of the bird happens and things like that, you really relate to the bird as a, somehow then some of the children have started following these birds and they've become really experts in bird watching. Then you have a whole group of children who've really taken up this flair for painting and documenting all that is there around them. And the third thing that really came into being was the intangible outcome is they came to know about a lot of things that were happening in their own surroundings, which they were slowly alienating themselves. The moment a community child goes to school, the parents think, oh my, she's going to school, then she'll have a very different future than mine. She will never be, when again, she doesn't need to know anything about fishing or anything that's happening here, because they start their dreams and aspirations start going. Similarly, the child also is groomed in a way to think that, when I grow up, I will become maybe, someone would say I would become an air hostess, I would become a beautician and things like that, where they do not really relate that what their future could be if they can really value the knowledge they have, or even connect the knowledge they have with other streams of knowledge that they are acquiring. So we were seeing that how this gap that had happened in all these years was increasing, and it's not just these fertile wetlands. If you look into any rural space, this is a divide or this is that, and that's how knowledge is being lost, because first of all we don't acknowledge these communities, second of all we don't acknowledge them as knowledge resources. And with time we've seen that one is that connection that has come through these storytelling processes, and this next is they can actually now feel confident to speak on their own about these stories. The little things that they have been observing and they have been recording, they can talk about it confidently, they can tell you much more about what they have seen, but they didn't think that that was worth telling. And there would be like people listening to it. So the moment people listen to what they are saying, they feel, oh, this is something that is valuable, this is something to be archived together. So this is a kind of, we would say in a broad sense, the kind of intangible outcomes that we see that the children, each year we celebrate the Jolabhumi Utsav, and it is to commemorate the World Wetland Day, which is 2nd Feb. This year also we are doing it, and we've spread it through December. It's just starting January and Feb, and we invite people, and this is an opportunity for us also to invite environment department, the BDOs, the panchayats, and to get all these voices across to the others. There are many things that we would like the government or the officials to know, which at times are ground realities, because you will find so much data online or in research papers, but what is happening on ground is missing there. You can definitely say that there are 10,000 species of this is the amount of wastewater that flows, this happens, that, but what is the ground reality among what is happening within the communities, how the livelihoods of these fishermen or the farmers being, the challenges that they're facing, the transformations that are happening. So these stories were very interesting because they would be telling, they know that hard reality, and that would be coming across through this. And all these processes, like this was also another thing that we learned in this process was how do we communicate with a group of children who do not have a smartphone or who are not being able to access technology, but we were trying to see them. So this was all the online interactions that we will be having with them. And in this course of time, about 1.5 years, we have been able to record a lot of stories which have come to be through their through different mediums in a way, I would say. This was also, the next part was how do we refine these stories, because the stories came in from different ends, and then, so we had a lot of experts who came in and who helped us. Even I would thank Padi for being, Namita's here, for being a constant help, because the questions that came from Padi made us really think about our process, really go deeper and find out what is the, the connections, maybe palm leaf weaving, which I actually had this in my hand. This is something which is not anymore being done. But to find out the reason, someone has written a story about their grandmother, who is, I'll go to that, yeah, this one, who used to weave this, and she's been weaving this for years, but now she's not continuing this. So why is it so? One of the reasons we found out is the palm leaf trees are gone because there's so much of encroachment that's happening, there's so much of climate change that's happening. The leaves are becoming shorter. So there were other issues that came up from these kind of questions that, so these are the two stories which you can find on Pari Education. So please take out some time and go through them. You will love reading them. They are written by the children of East Kolkata veterans, and this is the photo story which I was saying that she is so talented that she could become a photographer maybe. There are also 2 books that have been made. They're in the counter. I won't speak much. So they are the little stories which we've published and been illustrated by artists. So you could collect them, and I think the more people know about these stories and realize what is the issues behind it, it would be lovely. There are other stories about Nobina writing about the birds, because she's one of the eco guides and she knows so much about birds that I don't think I've spoken to many of the specialists and experts, they are stunned by her knowledge now. And this is a poetry which I wanted to, I have the sound piece, but we'll leave that. This is a poetry written by Preeti Hathi, and this is about how the wastewater canals are being blocked and changing, how things are changing now, and how it is important for us to look into these wastewater canals as resources, because they are not pollutants, they are nutrient. And this is this aspect of looking into the change of perception that is important. I think of anything, whether we are looking into any community, I think this whole idea about how do we look at them, how do we consider them not as rat pickers, but as value-added services that they give us, so which is very important. And this is this is the encroachment, on the encroachment, the comic strip that they've made. This is Priya Varun. These are some snippets from it. This is recipes that they've come up with, which are very authentic to the wetlands. And of course, about farming and how the variety of things that are grown there. So with all this, I would just end up and I would bring back what Arundhati said about living kitchen. And I think that's exactly what I think archives for us also means. It is a living kitchen, and every day there's something new that's being cooked, and we would really love to get it across to every one of you. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for this opportunity, and thank you, Nobina and Kirit, for bringing up some of the issues that overlap as we think through the water, let's say. So the project that is running at the moment, the installation at the Victoria Memorial Hall, is called Kolkata Noshikotha, or Sketches and Stories of Kolkata, and I'm going to talk about how we built it. So, I started from my own research, and which is on cinema, film history, and particularly film industry. And in some ways, when this call came up about working at the Victoria Memorial Archives and that this archive will be available, it became a kind of a provocation. In fact, I have used the literally to sort of here, but that works as a provocation. You know, provocation in the sense that how do we think of structures, how do we think of maps, how do we think of films? You know, there are these city trilogies and a number of them, set of city trilogies that we talk about, narratives, golpo, and also archival material. And there's a huge amount of material also at the Victoria Memorial, which is about a city that we imagine, that we visualize, that we narrativize, is around this central Calcutta. And that is how, you know, I began to think that is there a way to reroute our journeys through the city? Or do we, all of us, navigate the city through the same paths? Those are the questions that I began to ask her. So, these are some of the city projects that preceded before I arrived at the current one, where I was looking at, you know, in particular the one that I did, this one, which is with the Camp Mumbai in 2018, where we were, you know, able to look at the city from a different vantage point, which is, we were working from the site of Gem Cinema, which is a defunct cinema hall in ABC Bose Road. And as we set up the camera, we began to look at the city from a different axis, you know. As you see the image on that side, there is the Eden Gardens, there is Shoaib Minar, and there is also the Corporation House. So it became, while they are located on different roads, on different streets, they were appearing to us on a straight line. And that is important, you know. It began to sort of help me think through how a city is planned or imagined. Next slide, please. And yeah. So arriving at Route 033, which I called it that time, you know, that was the name I was thinking through. It was through research and rethinking, and from reading, obviously, to returning to the archives of Victoria Memorial Hall and particularly CSSS. Because what I was thinking was something like, you know, a map like a design, map like a piece of art, and the ways in which, let's say, a city can be planned, thought. And is there a way in which we can physically navigate? You know, can we find other routes? We all have other routes. You know, we all take different roads, different streets. Like a person who drives a car, he has a favorite way, and even if I tell him that from here, why are you taking that route? He seems to be comfortable navigating through that lane. So we're talking about that possibilities of remapping through through walking, through this bodily sort of intervention. So the key words became the place, the relationship that we have with the place, and also the larger question of design and planning. And therefore, when we talk about maps, I was also thinking of remapping. Next slide, please. The Victoria Memorial Archives has a huge amount of material, but not too much of the photographs of the city outside the central part. And there are Vaughan and Shepherd, and these are taken by others. But what next slide, please. Yes. So these then became for me, you know, as we worked in this sort of a really historic site, and it became the entire procedure of entering the Victoria Memorial to put it in Bangla, যেখানে ছোটবেলা সবাই এমনি প্রেম করতে যায়. So that then becomes an archive, you know, and you have to sort of navigate, and you have to find a way of understanding what this colonial imagination is, what kind of material enters into the archives of Victoria Memorial, how they are stored, the actual material is stored in vaults, and I don't think neither me nor Arjun ever saw the actual material, so we were looking into the digital material. So this became, I was constantly thinking there was something more, there's a possibility no, I mean this is something, we can do something else. So the next slide, please. And of course, this kind of thinking overlapped with my academic work and the research, and so that's sort of overlapping and developing, I would say. And so one of the things that I was doing at the time, we were, living a pandemic life, and we were at home, is to begin to think as to what does, how does cinema represent the city, and what are the ways in which, let's say, what is the cinematic map of the city, how is that imagined? And then I used two axes. One is the shifting technologies from celluloid to let's say, the new media. And then I begin to think about the places that are that recur in our, cinematic imagination. And what broadly became important to me was the one that I described as the map of the migrant, the other is the map of the refugee, and the question of interrace maps. I will not go into that, but I will come quickly to the kind of the next one. Yeah. So we had two set of conversations before I came to the idea that okay, fine, I will be following the Adi Canal. One is online Adda, as we call, which happened in October last year, and Ikshita is here. She also, spoke in that Adda. So we began asking, how do we traverse the city, and is there an experiential city? Do we experience? Is there a city in our memory, in our experience, and so on, which persists outside the plan of the city, let's say? And what are our personal and collective mapping? What are the processes? How do we create emotional and intimate geographies? So that's how we began to think, and we began to think what is our personal process of mapping. There were, mostly scholars and also artists were talking about different areas. What emerged through that dialogue, those conversations, was the para narratives, or the neighborhood narratives. They were talking about Cheapur, Park Circus, Kalighat, Ambasharot, and Kirit. And in that regard, the next one that we had this year in July, what we described as past and future maps, we began to think about maps that are possible. Maps that are there, maps that we know, and there are maps that are possible. And is there an unseen city? Is there a city that, is there a map that needs to be, has to be sort of understood and engaged with? So we began to talk about forgotten places and lived neighborhoods, personal and collective mappings. And we were, as I say that, what are the possible maps? But when we talk about these places and the processes of making maps, or newer maps, newer archives, we began to address places that have been erased or rebuilt or demolished and so on. And particularly, what becomes important is that when histories are unequal or the ecologies are unstable, what is the art practice? What does let's say a historian or an artist do? What is the meaning? What is the function? How do we intervene? Are the questions that we begin to ask. So in that session, there were scholars and famous artists, and we began to ask questions of practice. These are stills from Devulina's presentation, who is a filmmaker, and she was talking about Vijayawada colony, where, slowly, when following after partition, as quote-unquote refugees began to settle there, there was a steady sort of, outward movement of the Muslim, community and the owners of the houses. Next slide, please. And she brings in family archives. She is using interviews of her one Pishi, not her own aunt, but also Tree. Tree becomes a significant way of looking at these places, and I want to build on that. I want to put that as a key point as we develop, we go to the next part of the discussion. So, so she was talking about trees, ponds, and our changing neighborhoods, and also emphasizing what paras used to be and how they have changed, but particularly raising the question of ecology. Next slide, please. Okay, fine. These are simply photos of dogs. So next one. Yeah. Moderator, she was talking about how she worked with, she said that where their institution is, Chadehat, is literally the last sort of pin code of Kolkata. And she began to work with the people living in that place, and something that Nobina was saying, that this drive to that you need to close these cars because there are mosquitoes, there is waterlogging, so on and so forth. And she began to build these projects of building houses, and the subject of ecology and neighborhoods came together. So that's how I arrived at the question of sketches and stories and try to think through Adigonga and Torres Canal, because at least one thing is for sure, that canal is never, or a riverway, a waterway is never a straight line. And so, we begin to look at the entry of the canal, which is at that point Adigonga. And then we follow, and because it's a waterway, it takes multiple detours, and there is no straight line, right? Not like the roads. So it takes multiple detours, and it goes towards the west continuously. And if you follow the canal, you cannot all the time reach by a car, you have to walk. And two is that there is no straight line. There is no north to south or east to west kind of ways in which you can navigate. Next slide, please. So, Kolkata Noshikata, as I call it, it's at the moment it's a single channel video running in a loop in the Victoria Memorial. Can you please do the video? It's a short section. It's not from the film. It is the rush, and we will like footage, yeah, and we will talk about the rest of it. So there is no sound. This is a section from, basically a footage from the material, and as we begin to look, we take a kind of a map, like we see a map, like a bird's eye view have. It's an audio-visual map that we are trying to create. This is that is Kalighar Bridge, and we take a turn now. And what we move towards, what would end up being towards the Partho mode. And what became evident as this, the kind of view that camera offered us, is a sort of a lopsided development. You can see that the development in Calcutta has happened on one side of the canal. So the Adigonga actually, in effect, is up to the point of Kalighar, and the rest of it is a man-made canal that flows to the south of Kolkata and beyond. So, So you can stop here and go back to the PowerPoint. And so over a period of couple of months, we were making this quote-unquote film. But the question of installing it in Victoria Memorial, it became actually another part of the project, and that's what I want to talk about in the rest of the time that I have. The next slide, please. So, the site of the installation is important because here we are at a sort of a place which is subsumed by a grandeur, so this is the map that so from here that we enter to Palakkad to Dodgar to go this side, there is no name on the map. And here towards Yavapati Church, and there is no, this is not very clearly visible. But when I put that sort of an image of rest of it is archival image, and there is one sort of a sketch of a water. The young people who were collaborating with me and assisting me, they said, like, where did you get this and why? So precisely because there are no architectural wonder as we begin to move out of the center, and that is precisely the point, that we are moving beyond the existing maps and archival images, and we are following the track of Adi Ganga, which was expanded as Torres Canal. But through it, we're moving with the camera, we are producing a kind of a moving map. And the next one, please. So the site of this Grand Victoria Memorial, and we can quickly go through the next one. So how we arrived at, there were a lot of conversations, and initially I was thinking of rerouting, thinking through an alternative map through Paras. And how did we arrive at let's say something so sort of large? Is through reading about the possible mapping of the city outside, let's say the colonial period or even contemporary mapping, but let's say pre-colonial maps, and think about a landscape, about a geography that is not marked by streets, by roads, but by these waterways. And the next one, please. So these straight lines, these map of the cities, and this lotus-shaped Fort William, which is always at the center, and the process has been to find these routes which are not straight, which are not. So the next one, please. Yeah. So this is the entry point of Adi Ganga, and that it enters, and then it passes through these places, Taj Bengal, and the next one, please. So this one I just want to talk. This section is, you can't get here. Of course, you can get here, but not from the Calcutta side. You have to enter from the other side, because here is Alipur jail at the center, and this section is actually not sort of reachable. And not that I have images in my work, but I'm just drawing your attention to that what it is provoking. Because of course we are not allowed to shoot there. The next one. But I'm just trying to draw your attention to that what are the possibilities. This is the Saligan Rail Bridge, and this is actually, here, we were here, the shot that we saw, we were here, and we are again not supposed to shoot here, but we did manage, because this is Kalighat area, and we were not supposed to use or get permission to shoot, but we did manage. So that kind of following the canal became something important stop because it wasn't a road, it wasn't leading us to somewhere, but it was constantly forcing us to go out of the city. Also, the canal from this metro station comes here, this is the Itkola Pond, and it keeps going, then it bifurcates again, and then it goes on this side. So the installation that we have, our camera arrives here, it again goes back, so it keeps making these detours and confusing you for that matter. But my purpose was also not to produce data, not to produce material that necessarily sort of help us to create these statistics. It is the idea of producing a kind of an experiential kind of, that would force us to journey the city from different points of view. So next one please. So these are some of the images from the recce or going to the places and so on. And most of the places close to Adiganga, which are also not there in part of the film necessarily, the project that is playing at Victoria, because you can't shoot there, you can't take a car, you can't take a team, you have to walk and you have to keep walking. Next one please. Okay, these are our team, and that is one day when we were editing, and after editing twice we realized that we have put things in wrong order, because what had happened that our idea was that because we take the road, so our idea was after Alipur, the next stop as it were is the Chetla Bridge and Kavrakola, and then the next one is Kalighat Temple, and then you go southwards. But that is the way you take the road, that is the way we could take when we had a car and a shooting team. But that is not how the river, the Adiganga flows and even the canal flows. And obviously, then we realized that it's rather stupid of us, because obviously Kalighat Temple would come first and Kavrakola would come later. But we have been so much used to this kind of navigation. So the next slide please. So it is, but what I want to draw your attention to, that there is a leap between the video that I have made, that I played on the first day when we were opening, and the installation on site now in this place, which is okay, so these are the images of setting up the screen, and you can see it's beyond, it's like beyond me in any way, and next one please. So we were setting up the screen, and the next one please. And what it is producing when you're alone in that Victoria Memorial space, immersed by a curved screen, is the simple experience. And it is not about, as I said, it is not about producing more data. So at some moments there is only this water that is there, that is in front of you, and there's nothing else. And so this journey, from where we shot to the site of installation is what I want to talk about at end. Because we are at the site of a architectural wonder. It's like whatever, Taj Mahal or something like that, and a museum space, a revered space. And you just can't enter, you just can't walk into this space casually. Then the next one, and at the back of my mind, I also remembered, and that's why I possibly even applied for this project, is I remembered from the time when we were young, Vivan Sundarams, and that was really the first installation that I had ever seen in my life. Structure of memory that was installed at the Darbar Hall, and this idea of bringing railway tracks, bringing sacks, bringing into the space of colonial wonder is something that has had produced a meaning, and so that is what in some ways this project does, bringing like somebody said, ये गंगे नाली का फोटो क्यों निकाला? So when I said नाली नहीं है, गंगा है, so and in my sort of secular bubble, I have put Adiganga as like an old river, but Ganga immediately had many meaning to a number of people, obviously, and to look at that image of the water, just the water in that space is creating, and I've been sitting there and I've been sitting alone, and that has a particular meaning. But there are crowd when there are like really 1,000 people entering, and there's so much of dust that our projectors stop working, and that kind of thing is a different experience from an installation to it becoming a public art. So yeah, and the ways in which people are interacting, and it is a weird, almost a very kind of a unreal experience, and I haven't yet, it is so immediate that I haven't yet found words to explain what it means, that people stand there and just look at water, and the perception is that it must be important because it is happening at Victoria Memorial, but it is not in particular about pointing that look, here is an ecological disaster. It is about looking at, producing, let's say, an audiovisual map, producing a kind of leaving an imprint of time on this audiovisual material. And maybe the next part is what is happening over this month. It's this presence of this sort of Gandhi inside the Victoria Memorial. I just want to play, I'm done. I just want to, you can just go through the video, and yeah, that's an accidental image, but I thought that's nice. We will just play one video. Sound coming through. So on Sundays, just children come in and they perform. Maybe we just another very short like this, because that is quite interesting. Yeah, thank you.
So we have about 7 minutes for questions. So can I ask all of you to just ask questions, and maybe you can make your comments when you meet the speakers over tea. Right? So just short questions, please.
I have a question for Aishwarya ma'am. So this is regarding the newspaper reports on heritage. When I go through a lot of newspaper reports in Kolkata about the heritage sites here, I realize there is a certain romanticization of heritage, and things like encroachment and communities living in the heritage sites are sometimes, stigmatized, and they're seen as enemies and encroachers. So, and then I've never come across things like readers' letters in Kolkata newspaper, which is something interesting. So, how would you like to comment on this aspect of newspaper reportage, where issues like encroachment, which is actually a part of living heritage, is sort of criminalized or stigmatized to the public?
So it is something that comes up in Mysore as well. So just opposite the Devraja market was another market that was a temporary space, so to speak. And it got demolished overnight, right? There was nobody to question what was happening there, and there was nobody who could stand up to the corporation and say, you cannot demolish this. So those are questions that exist in Mysore city, and the thing is with the Devraja market, because A, it's a heritage structure, there is a certain amount of power that the tenants who work there still hold, however small and tiny it is, and that in a way sort of protects them. There are people who are answerable because of that. But otherwise, encroachments, or rather things that are seen as encroachments are easily done away with in a city like Mysore. I don't know what to say about readers' letters because Mysore is such a small city. There's a lot at stake. There is a lot of local activism that does happen, or what is considered as activism that does happen because of how small the city is, and also how small the readership of the Star of Mysore is. That is nothing when you compare it to populations of larger cities.
No, given that we are in an archive which looks at much earlier newspapers, so there's a way in which we treasure the early 20th century material. But what really struck me, I know Partho said no comments allowed, only questions, I'm still saying that, is how unfamiliar we've become already with that look of the newspaper, of the broadsheet kind of newspaper of the 70s and 80s. So, as somebody who recently worked on contemporary history, and I realized how important it is to be an archive, especially ephemera of that contemporary history. The question though I had to go through both about the university and about heritage awareness is, what is somewhere I read Hail the Maharaja. So what is the sense of the princely state, which architecturally is so present everywhere, the chhatris, the buildings, everything, vis-a-vis a new modernizing state, because Mysore had both identities, princely identity, and very, very important as this modernizing state, new engineering, new architecture, new education, all of that. I mean, again, I'm going by Janaki's book alone. So I'm thinking here is that how do these two images of Mysore culture come through in a recent newspaper, relatively recent newspaper like the Star?
But if you ask the second question, then we can answer.
So, since this panel was about rethinking public history, and I was, looking at the project and more the processes, because as someone who worked in a public history center, one thing that was very important is to work with the community, but not to create consensus history. So, basically to work with that. And so when we had done the Tipu project, then of course the students were petrified because they're both sides of the coin. There are people who are supporters of people who come out and say, why are you saying this? And then the others will say, why are you doing this? So I'm just wondering that your projects take different ideas of the public. So sometimes it's Ghana, sometimes it's the university, sometimes in case you are working directly with the community. In case of Madhuja's project, where I found the community is, when they come and interact with everything. So I'm just wondering, when you shoot, what kind of interaction with the community happened and how far did that shape what you're trying to do? And I mean, the same is true of all of you, including the Mysore Star, because obviously you also know about its present leadership. So, yes.
That was Indira's question was for all of you. So, to begin quickly, answer.
Hello. Basically, what you definitely said is working with the community definitely brings in a lot of challenges in the first go, and how do you actually enter into the community is very important.
gradual process, like this is nearly our 7th year now, working with the same schools and children and visiting them. And I think in the process it's not been that what should we do, it is more of a collective that we come together with the children, and then from the children it arrives at what should be our next step. How should we navigate all these challenges which are coming up, of doing things, or the processes that we should adapt, or sometimes the way the children respond to things that we think, no, this is what we had thought of the next step to take forward. We're going to just stay away from it, do something totally different, and sometimes it's even more challenging to come up with somewhere. How do we, if I talk about themes as climate change and sustainability to these children, it doesn't make any sense because they are leading sustainable life. The only thing is that they don't know that it's termed in that way. Or if we talk about climate change, he was talking about Narmada, and how they, when their houses are drowning, they're still praying, thinking that it's something welcoming. So, this whole approach and perception, or the interrelationship that I think the community or the children have with their surroundings, and I think that is how our processes keep evolving and changing with their associations and with their responses. So it's no linear process at all, and I think my team, I'm blessed with the team, and we all keep every day it's like working together and sitting, putting up our ideas and cancelling all that we discussed last year. So it's it's constant innovation, and I think in that way it helps. Many of us are creative practitioners, and it's nice that when we pull in our practices and see how we could mitigate these kind of challenges, and also to state things like about encroachment of East Kolkata wetlands, waste being dumped into these canals, or like the way the whole ecosystem is beautified. Calcutta is going through a big beautification. What do we do about it? So we try to take processes where children state these through their artworks, instead of really putting through. So somewhere it is a kind of veil we put on, we would say, it's an act that we do that to be able to state all this, and the children can say their ground realities to larger public.
I think Mysore is usually seen as synonymous with the royal family. But when we look at the history of the university and what kind of research the university is doing, we start getting different stories. Because the kind of people who are now in the university are writing histories not of the royal family. They will not even have access to the royal family, right? And that is why community histories, the rise of folklore studies within the Kannada department, all theses within Kannada are now folklore studies, right? So I think that and by looking at the university, by looking at the history of these departments, we start getting different stories of what is important to people in the university. And I think, we can see from there that Karnataka and the kind of corruption that is at all levels of public administration, you can really get a sense of that through the coverage of the newspaper. And I think having academics see the university as a site of study is quite important as well, because all academics will now say, oh, there was a high point, the glory days, the 60s of Mysore University, and then it's been a decline. And really to kind of think about what that means, and also sort of critique that a little bit is, I think, part of the project, where we move a little away from the royal family, because the royal family is ubiquitous. Because the city in some ways also designed around the palace, right? So sort of to move away from it.
So when every time I talk to someone in the city, they come up. Every time it's like I said, Maharaja Kattitu. They say this was built by the Maharaja, but it stops there because all of these spaces, all of these buildings are parts of daily lives that have no connection at all to the royal family itself, and in a way that the modernity of the city that exists in its traders, in its businesses, in its industrial area that's growing outside of the center of the city is, they talk about it like, so when you talk to people in the city, they say it's growing so differently, but that growth is outside of the center, but the center is also very far away from the palace in itself, so that split is obvious. And
the communities are also clearly divided in the way that the city itself is divided, right? Like the city has that center and the palace and all of the elite that live around it, who still have those heritage houses. So they are also part of the people that I talk to, the project that I'm doing, but their idea of what is heritage and what is culture is very different from what it is in different parts. So communities in Mysore are approached in different ways, and there is a certain privilege that I have that I use while approaching them, obviously, and it works because it gives me access to them. But each community, I think, it requires a certain kind of approach there because they all have different things to say. And usually they're talking to each other through me. So they'll be referring to different people in different communities and they expect me to know and convey that as well. So that's also an interesting position to have in the city.
So quickly, because in a way the scope is so large and there's a large map, but within that I see that this project possibly has three parts. One is what I call as walking along Adi Ganga, which involves more research but also shooting, and there isn't one community, right? And what particularly is interesting is that the ghat that go up north, up along the sort of riverfront development to this kind of ghat are really small one. And what is interesting, like I'll give you one. Yeah, okay. So I just, the photograph that IFA has used of Shiv and Mona Lisa. So we met this guy who was sitting there, and so generally people are chilled out, they're a little high on this small ghat, which is very interesting, which is I describe as the alternative rhythm of life, right? Yeah, so what is interesting, that community knows about Dali, knows about Mona Lisa, and there is a different way in which the day passes, what they do, how they spend the day, what kind of work. So that itself is interesting, that interaction of what I describe as walking. And there is another community that is now gathering at Victoria Memorial, who are in many ways tourists. So that again is a different kind of way in which this becomes a catalyst, this sort of fluid thing, which is almost non-descriptive, like Gandhi Nali yahan kyun hai. So that brings in new kinds of interaction, but also brings in these alternative communities, as in they produce alternative communities.